Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us. I'm Kelly Altizer with the Institute for Engagement and Negotiation at UVA. This is the Coalition Building for Legislation on Heirs Property room. So if this is not where you intended to be, you can go ahead and switch rooms now, but hopefully this is where you meant to be. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our speakers, but I just want to give you a heads up about how you can expect this breakout room to work today. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on the presentation and allow about 10 minutes for questions. If you would like to go ahead and if you think of questions while they're speaking, we invite you to put the questions in the chat, or you're welcome to hold them until we get to the Q&A portion. Either of those works fine. And I lost my train of thought, but that'll come back to me. I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters. Ebonie Alexander is the Executive Director with the Black Family Land Trust, and Parker Agelasto is the Executive Director of the Capital Region Land Conservancy. They both have extensive bios. They've done great work in their careers. In the interest of time, I'm not going to elaborate any more on that, but we welcome you to visit their bios, which you can find on our website, along with the other folks who are presenting today. So Ebonie and Parker, I'm going to turn it over to you, and welcome everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Let me just give you a little bit about how we're going to do this. Parker and I have been working together on this issue of heirs property along with Vault for about 2 years now, going into the third year. And Parker and I are just going to talk back and forth about our process. We're going to use the framework for collaborative, equitable collaboration. We put some of our activities into this framework. One of the things that we do want to stress is that the way we see it is that you come into the framework where you are. You don't necessarily have to start with trauma informed. And in our case, we entered with deliberativeness. We knew what we wanted to do and we started doing it. So the background is really very simple. Around 2018, the Virginia Bar Association did an article on the Black Family Land Trust and our efforts to work with people who had heirs property and trying to form a pro bono program. That article led Parker to call me and say, what can I do to help? How can we work together? About 2 months after that, in a meeting in South Carolina, I met with Thomas Mitchell, who is the author of the Uniform Petition Heirs Property Act. And he said, Ebonie, can you get something going in Virginia? Which I responded, sure. And then I approached Ellen with Vault, and the rest is history. Ellen said, yes, we can try it. We put it before Vault, and the rest is history. So that was kind of the formation, the early formation of the players. And then what we'll go into is a little bit more. Heirs property, as you may know, is one of the leading causes of land loss in the African-American community, but it is not an issue of race, class, ethnicity, gender, or geography. Heirs property is an issue of lack of adequate resources, education, and financial resources. So if you have 100 acres in Brunswick County, Virginia, and you die without a will, you die intestate and you create heirs property. If you have a $100,000 condo on Broad Street in Richmond and you die without a will, you create heirs property. So the issue is, how do we help people, one, clean up heirs property, and two, prevent them from creating more heirs property. So how we approached it is, once I approached Ellen Shepard, who is the executive director of Vault, which is the Virginia United Land Trust, if you don't know. Vault was our other partner in crime in this. And without Vault, I don't know that we really would have been successful. I have said for a very long time that this whole effort was a case study in collaboration of different people and different organizations coming together to address one common goal. So Parker, I'm going to let you pick up from the 2019 filing, and then we'll go to the 2020 filing and give the rest of the story.
Well, thank you, Ebonie, and that's great background, and it's a pleasure to be here with those who want to learn a little bit more about the framework and what we did. And as Ebonie explained, we kind of came at this deliberatively, and for my background, my father is an attorney, my grandparent was an attorney, and my father had done pro bono legal service for several families in Nelson County to clear heirs property. So I was very familiar with the issue and how it diminished value primarily for the landowner. In the cases that my dad had helped with, they were African-American families as well. And when I read the article, I knew, why not go for the legislative fix through the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, and let's address this universally for all people, not just who's getting pro bono service and whose opportunity is there for the assistance. And so when I reached out to Ebonie, we strategized. We were kind of newly forming as a group, and we thought this was a slam dunk. We thought, gosh, every state, Texas, South Carolina, all these very red states with their legislatures controlled by the Republican Party, just like Virginia at the time, were passing the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act unanimously, and that it was widely supported by the Republicans in those states. And we thought, this is going to be a victory in Virginia, and we wanted to get it introduced. We didn't take much time because with legislators, they have limited number of bills, et cetera. So we reached out to Senator Dance, who represents the Petersburg to Richmond area, to help introduce the legislation. But a lot of legislators knew the issue. And frankly, we thought this is going to be relatively easy. We went in, and the worst thing happened. We didn't know what we didn't know. And all of a sudden, at one of the committee meetings, representatives from the Virginia Bar Association, who had just published the story about heirs property, stood up and said, "We don't know anything about this, and we need time to study it." And for those of you that aren't familiar with the legislative process, typically bills go to studies, often to be killed. And we thought we were done at that point, but we weren't giving up. And so one of the things that was critically important in with the legislation was it identified who we needed to work on as our coalition, who we needed to educate, and what hurdles existed for us. And I remember just saying, hearing before, and I don't remember the source of the quote, but don't be afraid of failure. And if you are going to fail often, because it does allow for you to understand and move forward. And I think that that's part of the adaptive process, understanding where your shortcomings are and reforming. So with that, I'm going to let Ebonie kind of mention where we went, but leading into this, Rosalind Dance did not win re-election. So our key patron from that year was no longer in office. So we had some strategy that we had to change. We also knew that the Virginia Bar Association was our key hurdle. And we thought we had others that we were going to rely on as partners who then also ended up being somewhat of a hurdle. I specifically reference, we had talked to the Richmond Bar Association, who saw this as a big urban issue. And unfortunately, the Virginia Bar I mean, the Richmond Realtor Association saw this as a big urban issue, and the Virginia Realtors opposed it. So it was a very interesting dilemma within other organizations. But Ebony, I'll kick it back to you to talk about the next steps in our coalition building.
Thanks. One thing I failed to mention as I was saying everything was lining up, the 2018 Farm Bill came out, and in the 2018 Farm Bill, it said that landowners who were living in states that had adopted the Uniform Petition Heirs Property Act would be able to participate in USDA programs, meaning that they would have access to financial resources that they hadn't had access to before because they had heirs property. So that was another one of the motivators that we had. So what we did, again with Vault, we formed a coalition. Vault was the lead in it, along with the BFLT. And we did some groundwork. The trauma-informed piece is when you look at land loss and you look at family land loss, that is traumatic for any family. I don't care what color you are. When you lose family land, you've lost a part of who you are, you've lost a part of your culture, you've lost a part of your heritage. And that's a very traumatic thing for a lot of people, whether they're Black or white, particularly when the land's been in the family for multiple generations. One of the things that we knew and learned is that we had the stories of people who were in the midst of heir property disputes. And heir property essentially is tenancy in common. That means that everybody that follows that bloodline is heir to this property. They all have different ownership rights, but they all own it in common. And that creates the big problem. If you can just think about trying to get all of your siblings and say all of your first and second cousins to agree on something, that's what you need to do in order to begin to address an heir property situation. And I'll just share a brief story with you. Ralph Sampson, the basketball player, that I did not know who he was the first time I met him. I just thought he was a very tall guy. His family approached us about 5 years ago. They had just begun an heirs property dispute, and it was between the first generation. It was his mother and his uncles and his aunts. And they worked on that for almost 5 years before it was resolved. And the role that we played at the BFLT was to continue to provide encouragement and to help them understand the first thing about this is that it's not going to be an easy process. But when I think about Ralph's family and when you hear him talk about the passion he had of how he grew up there, the history of the Blakely farm, how his grandfather purchased the farm, and the man who sold it to him because he had 9 children and he knew that he'd be able to work the farm. And how that farm was such a central part of their lives throughout his life, and how important it was to his mother, although she didn't live on the farm then. And like most families, you have people who have a connection and people who don't. And those people who don't, because they didn't grow up on the farm, generally don't have that same connection. So for them, it's easy to say, we'll sell, we can just sell. In Ralph's case, they had competing appraisals. It took them to the Supreme Court of Virginia that then sent them to mediation. And fortunately, Ralph and the family prevailed. They were able to buy out the family members who wanted to be bought out. But the worst part of it is, and I'll always remember him saying this to me privately and then again publicly, that he has cousins and he has an aunt that he spent summers with, slept in her house, ate at her table, that he knows he won't speak to again in life. And that's one of the worst things about this. And that is really, really the trauma of it all. When you look at the plan.
If I could
Go ahead,
also,
Mark.
if I could also add that there's that trauma and it's family to family trauma, but there's also this kind of sense of being violated. That not only have you lost trust, but when a predator comes in to try to divide or acquire family land that is heirs property, they typically are doing it somewhat maliciously. They're using a court, they had been using the court system and manipulating it and doing it in a way that was not beneficial to the family, whether they held onto the land or had to sell at a discount. And in many cases, it's kind of like a theft. And it's that type of personal violation that had occurred. And one of the reasons why the adoption of heirs property legislation was critical was to stop those practices.
Thanks, Parker. It is trauma, and you do feel violated. And because so many people have lost land for different reasons, primarily in the African American community, there was a lot of land loss because of practices of USDA, of local units of government, of banks, and people just lost their land. They were told that they hadn't paid the taxes when they did, or in the case of USDA that settled 2 Pickford settlements, there were all kinds of discriminatory practices by FSA that caused landowners to lose their land. So when we started to look at this, again, we realized that heirs property affects everyone, and we didn't want it just to be framed around one group of people or one geography. One of the great things about it was we were able, in our list of partners and collaborators, was the Richmond Real Estate Commission agreed to support the legislation, but the statewide of the same body chose not to. And the reason is because in urban areas, you have land or housing that's been in the family for multiple generations that have no clear title to them. And then you can't sell them. Each jurisdiction and municipality handles it a little bit differently, but that's heirs property, and it needs to be resolved if you're going to sell it, or if you're going to try to buy it out for some development. Whatever is happening, you still have to resolve that heirs property situation. So we realized early on that this was important. So in July of 2019, we did a full court press of how we were going to address this. We decided that we would find a rural person, a sponsor, and an urban sponsor. To that end, we were able to get Senator Frank Ruff, who is rural Republican from Mecklenburg County, Virginia, to be the sponsor on the Senate side, and then Delegate Hope from Northern Virginia was the sponsor on the House side. We were able to get the language in the bills the same, so as we traveled through the process, we didn't have to worry about competing bills because of the language. We had a coalition that met, I think it was the first Friday of each month from July until December, and then we started meeting weekly through the session. Everybody had an assignment. Everybody carried out his or her assignment. We knew what our goal was to get it passed. And then we hit a roadblock that, you know, I almost wanted to weep when I heard it. And it was something called the Boyd's-Gray Commission. And I'm going to let Parker, who between Parker and Steve Lemon and Thomas Mitchell and Ben Orlesky, I think, am I leaving anybody out? Ellen, help if I did. Yes, Chris Nolan, were able to negotiate this. And this is one of these hidden landmines in coalition building. We had no idea that we would end up with the Boyd's-Gray Commission. And what it represents, and who they are. So Parker, explain a little bit about that and how we got through that process and what getting through that process did for us.
Sure. So the going back to 2018, when the Virginia Bar Association asked to study this proposal, their lobbyist by the name of Jeff Palmore had made the request. And in 2019, when we were trying to do the full court press, I kept on asking him, well, what was going to be their process to study and come back for their recommendation? And I wasn't getting a whole lot of clear answers, but we were communicating. And communicating is the most important component, is to just keep in dialogue, making sure that that even though you might feel like you're on opposite sides of an issue, that you're willing to work through and persevere. And so Jeff said, well, we're going to be presenting this to the Boyd Graves Conference. And that's an area where the Bar Association is not particularly unanimous in its position for legislation. So they sent it to a conference where they have subcommittees that then do the research and present the case, but they're not making the case for or against necessarily. It then goes to the Bar Association Boyd Graves Conference membership to vote. And who's on the Boyd Graves Conference? How do we reach out to them? We weren't very clear. And we were working with attorneys who were members of the bar that were not involved in the Boyd Graves Conference, but they could reach out to some of them. So it was one of these processes that was not transparent to us. And how do you get support from those that you know you need, but they're not signaling how they will work with you. And in this case, the subcommittee was chaired by an individual whose name was David Gogol out of Fairfax, Virginia. And that was probably the key to passing this through the Boyd Graves Conference. David Gogol had done a lot of research. He knew the issue, pros and cons. We introduced him to Thomas Mitchell, who is the primary scholar, so that they could talk about it. He knew Delegate Hope, who is a practicing attorney up in Fairfax. So there was some effort on his part to reach us where we were. But at the same time, in looking at the UPHPA, which is the Uniform Petition of Heirs Property Act, and in looking at Virginia's law, they came back and said, you know, we don't want to just adopt the UPHPA separate of reforming all of Virginia's statutes related to petition. And so the recommendation was coming out that they reform it for all classes and not just those that address heirs property ownership. And it was because that was the direction they were going. It was not what we were asking, but it was the direction that they thought that they could get more unanimous support out of the Bar Association. And again, it was an opaque process to us. We didn't know how it would occur. And yet we were now trying to understand what's the timing. We're trying to get legislation introduced for the 2020 session. How are we working through this? Chris Nolan, who was with McGuire Woods and is the Virginia Commissioner to the Uniform Law Commission, you know, he wasn't sure how the commission would respond if they didn't just adopt the wholesale legislation. Having the wholesale legislation was important to leverage the Farm Bill funding. So now all of a sudden we've got a group who's willing to move towards us, but they want to open up the universe. And ours was a very narrow approach. And we really said, okay, let's evaluate this. And if we can get the Bar Association, who previously opposed, to say that they will support with the expansion, and we can go back to the Uniform Law Commission and Thomas Mitchell, who's really the author of that legislation, and get them to agree that this revision works for their purposes, and it certainly worked for our purposes, then maybe we have agreement and we can move forward. And it was an interesting, probably about 4 people who really came to that decision and consensus, but it had a huge, huge impact on what the coalition was able to achieve. But it took those individuals being creative, being able to think outside of the box, to not go in with preconceived notion of my way or the highway. And at the end, what we had was a piece of legislation that brought our group and our opposition from 2019 together. And we had a bill that everybody was working to advance. And it got introduced as the bill that everybody was working to advance. So we were already harmonious when we were going to the legislature. And frankly, being able to speak with a unified voice in that regard was essential for passing the legislation. You know, it was great that we had identified a Republican out of the rural communities and a Democrat out of the urban communities, but it really was going to be relying on the 40 senators and the 100 delegates to get this thing done.
Parker, I don't want to interrupt, but we do need to turn to questions in just a moment.
Well, I was going to allow Ebonie just to explain what the conclusions were.
Awesome. Okay, great.
So very quickly, thank you, Kelly. Very quickly, we ended up, and I also want to say that Secretary Bettina Ring testified on behalf of the legislation during committee, and that was a rarity for her and for the committee itself, those committees. But where we ended up was with unanimous passage all the way through. It went to the governor's desk, the governor signed it. We in Virginia have one of the best uniform petition heir property acts in the country. In fact, both Thomas Mitchell, who is the author of the bill, and Ben Arletsky, who is at the Uniform Commission, have been using our bill now as a way of helping people to understand how you can expand it. They also call it the Virginia model because we took a different approach than most states that have adopted it. We adopted it, we were number 17 in the country. So the Uniform Petition Act from Virginia to Florida, less North Carolina, and all the way across to Texas have now adopted. 17 states have adopted the act. And we're really proud and excited. We believe that the act will do a great deal to help those people who find themselves in that situation of heirs property, but it also helps people who just have general real estate issues. So we can take questions from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Ebonie and Parker. So I'm going to pull questions from the chat. If you have any, feel free to put them there. I'm going to ask our presenters to please be as succinct as possible in answering so we can get through as many as possible in the next few minutes. I'm going to give preference to questions that have an equity component or focus on equitable collaboration components. So question from Lance, do you have any suggestions for Virginia as a Commonwealth to move away from a process where a relatively small amount of people had a significant influence on the outcome of your legislation?
Wow.
You want to take that one, Ebonie, or you want me to jump in?
You jump in. I have to think about that for a second.
So this is a very good question. And unfortunately, that is what lobbyists are. That is what lobbyists are. And until there is reform in how influential lobbyists can be, or the access that they have, or place a requirement on any of these kind of studies or recommendations to have stakeholder engagement, it's not going to advance. I will say on the local level, when, at least in the city of Richmond, when a developer comes with a plan of development that needs certain approvals at the city, they do require that they reach out to the community the neighbors within a certain distance of that property, and civic organizations. And so there are requirements for engagement at local levels. Why we don't have that at our state levels is beyond me.
I'll just add very quickly, it is one of the reasons that we as citizens need to become more involved and understand how our government works so that we know where we can step in and what we can ask for. It is really our responsibility as citizens to understand better how our government works.
Thank you. That was very profound, Ebony. I felt like I was cheering there at the end when you were talking. Another question from Roy Hoagland. Can you share with us any examples of what has happened in Virginia as a result of the passage of the legislation? Has it made a difference, or are you seeing positive results?
I think it's too early to tell if it's made a difference. The bill only went into effect in July 1 of 2020. And of course, we've been in a pandemic, so some of the courts have been closed. I do know that we being the BFLT, have about 3 clients who we asked to postpone their action until after the bill was enacted. And they are now in the process of starting their heirs property resolution. So it's just too early to tell, I think.
Well, and I would also articulate that there's been a big public awareness campaign. A lot of people don't know about the legislation. They don't know how it impacts them. And so now that it is adopted, there have been a number of webinars and programs. Our coalition did a big op-ed campaign where I think we had probably 4 or 5 op-eds published in papers from Roanoke to Northern Virginia to Richmond to Tidewater. And so the big push for public awareness to make sure that those that are impacted are aware now of the changes in the law. The other thing that I would articulate is that there are other laws that needed to start to change that help to embrace and support those properties that are heirs property. And there's another bill that Ebony worked on this year that passed in the House 100-0, again, trying to work to stabilize some of these properties so that they can remain in the family. So there's that effort as well. And then just the standardization of a process for resolving these issues and evaluating properties that are heirs property and involving the courts should streamline it so that there become cost efficiencies over time to address these. But the cost is still the cost. It's a very high cost to resolve. And so one of the other initiatives that has really built steam is creating this kind of legal consulting group that Ebony and the Virginia State Bar have been putting together.
Great, thank you. We have just a moment before we're all going to be pulled back to the main room and you'll get to select your next breakout group. If you could please join me in the chat or using your reaction button to say thank you for Ebony and Parker for the great presentation. I invite you to visit their websites if you'd like to learn more about the work that they did on this important topic. Thank you, everyone.